Creating an amazing product doesn't mean much if you lose a bunch of money in the process. That's why mastering your costs and minimum order quantity is absolutely essential to your success in both the short and the long term, and an important concept to master before you even start your Kickstarter campaign. In this lesson, you'll learn about the main product cost categories, how to create a bill of materials, and how to set your minimum order quantity. We've tried to craft the lesson to be general enough for anyone to get value out of, but some of these pricing concepts make the most sense when your end goal is a tangible manufactured product. Let's start by understanding the main product cost categories. Many creators make the mistake of focusing solely on the price per unit quoted by their manufacturer. While this is certainly an important factor, it's just one piece of the larger financial puzzle. To truly understand your costs, you need to consider the full spectrum of expenses involved in bringing your product to market. Here are the main product cost categories to understand. Manufacturing costs. This is the price per unit charged by the manufacturer based on your minimum order quantity, MOQ. It includes the cost of material, laborers, and their overhead. Setup costs. Some products may require tooling, setup, or mold costs before your product can be manufactured. This is normally a one-time cost which is paid before you start production. Certification costs. If your product is in the food space, then it may require FDA approval. If electronic, you may be required to provide certification from a third party that your product is safe. Often your manufacturer can have these certificates already, but it's best to check if you are required to cover any of these costs. Packaging and branding. Don't forget to factor in the costs of packaging, materials, labels, and any branding elements like custom inserts or hang tags. Shipping and logistics. These are the costs associated with getting your product from the manufacturer to your fulfillment center or customers. These can include freight forwarding, custom duties, and domestic shipping. Make sure you keep track of these costs in a spreadsheet and keep the numbers updated as you get more cost information. Next, let's talk about how to create a bill of materials. To get a true picture of your costs, I recommend requesting a detailed bill of materials, BOM, from your supplier that breaks down your product into all its components and parts. I talked about this briefly during the lesson on finding the right manufacturer. This is hands down the most powerful tool for understanding and negotiating your costs, so I'm going to take a bit more time to explain it now. However, depending on what your idea is, not all products will require a bill of materials. For example, board games, you may require to have several different parts and pieces with different materials, but if it's a card game, then there isn't really much material to analyze. So here's how it works. Let's say you're producing a camping chair. Your BOM would list out every material and component that goes into that chair. The metal tubing, the thickness of the metal tubing, the fabric, the stitching, the printing, the packaging, and so on. Then you gather quotes from multiple suppliers for each of those components. Having this granular breakdown allows you to compare costs line by line and identify areas where you might be overpaying. If one supplier is charging you double for the metal tubing, you can point to your other quotes and negotiate them down. Or you might realize that upgrading to a higher quality fabric is worth the added cost for the improved customer experience. Your BOM is a valuable tool for modeling out different cost scenarios based on your order quantity. You can request pricing from your supplier to see how your per unit cost changes at different production volumes. Next, let's talk about how you set your minimum order quantity, or MOQ. MOQ refers to the smallest number of units a manufacturer is willing to produce in a single production run. This number varies widely depending on the product, materials, and manufacturer, but it's a crucial factor in determining your overall costs and profitability. In general, higher MOQs mean a lower per unit cost, as manufacturers can achieve economies of scale with larger production runs. The larger the quantity they are producing, the more efficient their production line can be, and the lower material costs based on the volume that can be passed down to you. However, higher MOQs also mean a larger upfront investment and more inventory risk. You'll need to carefully balance your MOQ with your sales projections and cash flow. Why it's important to discuss MOQ with your supplier before your campaign is that you can use this information to set your project goal, amount to raise, and planning your budget. But your MOQ doesn't just impact your per unit cost, it also affects your shipping and logistics expenses. Shipping costs are often determined by the volume and weight of your shipment, and there are certain breakpoints where it becomes more cost effective to ship larger quantities. For example, let's say a 20-foot shipping container can hold roughly 1,800 units of a backpack. If we only order 1,500 units, then we'll be paying to ship some empty space in that container. But if we increase our order to the full 1800 units, we're maximizing our shipping efficiency and reducing our per unit shipping cost. Of course, you want to make sure you have the proper demand and funding before you set your MOQ, but this is where the magic of Kickstarter comes into play. Because backers are pledging to your product before you make your product, you will know exactly what your demand is and how much money you're going to receive. But this also allows you to set your campaign amount based on what is a stated MOQ from the manufacturer, and you have communicated with that with the supplier before launching your campaign. Now, I know that navigating these costs and MOQ decisions can be overwhelming, especially when you're working with multiple suppliers and try to compare quotes that aren't always apples to apples. That's why I've created a simple costings calculator that you can use to just plug in all your variables, product costs, order quantities, shipping dimensions, duty rates, plus much more. And automatically this thing will calculate your total landed cost per unit. Remember, this information is calculated before you launch your campaign, so you will know exactly how much you need to spend to bring your project to life, as well as knowing how profitable you'll be when you decide to launch. I've included the link to this costing calculator below this lesson, so let's do a quick live demonstration together so I can show you how to use this properly.
Yes. So I just want to show you real quick a costings calculator template which I've created for you guys, and you'll see a few different shades of colors. Now, this light yellow color is something that you can totally change and you can update and you can tweak those cells, no problem. And the gray ones are something which will be automatically calculated for you. So I just want to run you through it real quick. At the top, we can put in the projected number of units we want to order. We can predict that we're going to order like 750 units based on our pre-launch list or anything like that. But then during the campaign, if it goes really well and you actually, you're going to do 2,000 units, then you can just update that anytime. But that's very, very important. What's the order quantity? Then you decide the selling price that you're going to be selling your product for. Let's just put $99 for now. Then I've got the manufacturing cost of goods, right? So maybe we've got a quote from the supplier that we want to work with, which is 24.7. Now, I've added notes on the side here because if you have, like, let's just say other components in your product, like, so 3 items coming together, one is costing you 10, the other one's 8, the other one's 6.7, then you know where that 24.7 is coming from. Something else is that, like, this is the most important one to fill out, the first production run. And I've added a future production run as well, just because we're going to have some costs in our first production run, such as mold costs and sample costs, which are very unlikely to show up in the second production run. So you can kind of figure out what is your profitability for your first production run, and then how will it change for future production runs. So 2,000 units we're going to order of an item, which is $99. 24.7 is our quoted cost from the supplier. Now, mold cost, I've just put here $2,000, but let's say it's quite high. Let's say it's $10,000. You can see that $1 went to $5. Our sample costs were $500. Let's just say it was $800. You can see that's now gone to 40 cents. Freight cost, I would just calculate this roughly because you're only going to know the freight cost at the time of which you need to ship, because the freight charges update monthly. So earlier in 2024, it was around $4,000 a container. Later in the year, it's around $8,000 a container. And that's if you're shipping a full container. If you're shipping a less than a container load, then it'll be slightly cheaper. But maybe you want to plan for the worst case scenario, full container, highest price has been $8,000. Let's put it in as that. I always like to over exaggerate the numbers. So I'll see, like, what's my worst case profitability. And then if I can get better pricing or better shipping rates or less sample cost, or I get that sample cost deducted or refunded, then my margin is only going to improve. But I wouldn't like it to be the other way, where I haven't forecasted how expensive it could be. So then the import duty rate, I've just put here is 15%, but let's say there's a tariff that comes in and it goes up to 40%, then we just add that there. And let's just say packaging, there's no additional cost, that's included in the unit cost. It's always important to have a pre-shipment inspection, so I've just added that in there as well. Now, this is your total landed cost to get from your factory overseas to your warehouse, wherever that be in the United States, if you're sending it there. If your 3PL is going to charge you anything for receiving the goods, you can add that in. And if you know your final fulfillment cost to the customer, you can add that in as well. And I've left one empty cell if you want to add any additional costs in here as well. But generally, we're covering the cost of the goods the cost of molds, samples, the cost of your freight, and the cost of your import duty, and any related quality control costs, such as inspections as well. Now, for 2,000 units, we know that our total cost is going to be $68,000 based on everything we've listed here. But if we decide, right, we're actually only going to do 500 units, you can see how that comes down to $31,000, but then a large chunk of that is a shipping cost. So you can play around with these numbers, right? And you might say, you know what, this 26.5% profit margin, I'm not too happy with that. So I'm actually going to sell this for 125 now. And then your margin jumps up to 40%. So this is why it's really important to have a rough idea of how much your goods cost and what you're paying for such things, so you can really come up with an accurate selling price. Now here I've also just added a cell here for your HTS code, which is your import duty code. And you might want to play around with different codes, insert different codes in there to arrive at the correct code for your product. And you can find out the best import duty rate by asking your supplier what they use for their other customers in your market, researching the HTS code website, and also checking with your freight forwarder as well, who have a customs clearance department within their company. Now, for future production runs, you can play around with this later on. The green side is the most important, but based on your order volumes going up, you might negotiate a discount, you get that down. We now don't have any mold costs. That was for the first order only. Maybe the duty rate we're able to get at a lesser rate because we changed the classification code, or maybe the tariffs are no longer imposed. Maybe the freight cost has come down. A lot of things can change, but even if you keep things exactly the same, you will see you'll be much more profitable on your second order because you don't have the mold costs and sample costs and things like that. So just play around with the cells in the yellow, don't touch the cells in the gray, and you'll get your total unit profitability and your total profit margin and your total order cost for your first production run.
All right, that covers this lesson. I hope you have a much better idea of how to understand all of your production costs before you launch your campaign. We'll see you in the next lesson.